Thank you all very much indeed for coming. This is a last opportunity for the final 5 people to stand on my left-hand side. It is hardly necessary to introduce Professor Zinn. The fact that we are unable to fit everybody into this room is testament enough to his relevance, his enduring relevance, and particularly for us as a university, because amongst the many other things that Howard Zinn has been, he has been a very great educator at Spelman and at Boston University, and has made students and education and writing a very important part of his contribution to our society and to his activism. He's not simply relevant, however, for Harvard, but also for our current predicament. We're looking at a new administration and another surreal gap between the rhetoric and the reality of policy. And I believe that Howard Zinn in his life has shown reality. Initially as a bombardier during the Second World War, and then as a very courageous activist from Vietnam to Iraq, he has perpetually questioned the pretensions, the surreal pretensions of administrations, particularly in relation to human rights. Given his work on civil rights, one might have expected him today to be speaking about freedom of association, freedom of speech, or equal access to the law, all of which were human rights issues which were very relevant at that period of his life. However, he has chosen today to speak to us about UN Article number 25, which, as you know, relates much more to health and basic livelihoods. He is a voice who I hope will be able to speak in questions on a range of different issues, but for all the reasons that I've mentioned, his reputation as a great educator, a great activist, a man whose voice is particularly relevant today with the new administration, we very warmly welcome you, and thank you very much indeed for coming.
Thank you. The crowdedness of the room certainly is a testament either to my drawing ability or to the size of the room. As I said before I was introduced, because I like always to, speak before I'm introduced. So, I said to you, I don't know who you are, which means, and every speaker, everybody who approaches a new group has this feeling, who are these people? They probably know more than I do about this subject, but I'll take my chances. So, I was asked to come in here and talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and asked to choose one of the articles, and I knew about Article 25, it sort of jumps out at you. I think it covers so much, and so I chose Article 25. You all know about Article 25? Right? I don't have to read it to you, do I? Maybe I will, just to remind you, okay? Basically, it says everyone has a right to decent standard of living, to, food, shelter, and health care, and it says the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control, and then makes a special point of motherhood and childhood being entitled to special care and assistance. So, after I said yes, that I would come and talk about this, I wondered, what is there to say? Everybody agrees. I mean, who's opposed to this? Everybody wants everybody to have food and shelter and clothing and medical care, of course. It's not controversial. Now, why is it not controversial? There's no because it's not enforced. What's there to? There's no argument about it. It's there. It's just words on a paper. It's a document. And since nobody is moving to enforce it, there's nothing to argue about. As soon as people move to enforce it, then you get into trouble. Then you get into political argument, and then you get into arguments about economics, but no, nobody really has moved to enforce it. And so it has the same status as so many other documents which are noble and which are unenforced. And I mean, thou shalt not kill. Just take the most horrifying example of something which everybody agrees to and which has yet to be enforced. But here in the United States, that you think of the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, which, when you look at them, and I suppose at the time of the past you looked at them, wow, great. Everybody's entitled to the equal protection of the laws. Nobody shall be denied, have their privileges taken away without due process of law and so on. And then for 100 years, the 14th and 15th Amendments were totally unenforced for 100 years. So that's a situation we face when we are confronted with a statement which is a wonderful statement of intent, but which is really, I started to say dead, which sounds a little it sounds too final. Let's say dormant. If something is dormant for 100 years, then you begin to suspect that it's dead, but it's not really dead. So yeah, it's dormant, okay. So what stands in the way, and this is what I was thinking about, what stands in the way of it being reality? So I jotted down a few things. When you're speaking somewhere, you have to admit that you jotted down a few things. And so I thought, well, first, simply knowing this reality, that is really knowing it. You say everybody's entitled to food and standard of living and a place to live and so on. First of all, you have to know that huge numbers of people do not have this. And you might say, well, everybody knows it, but they don't know it. Well, you know that. There are different depths to knowing. There's knowing and there's knowing. There's knowing, oh yes, it's true. Yes, I know 27 people were killed yesterday by a Predator missile. I know that. No, you don't. You don't. You weren't there. Or you didn't even read the account by somebody who was there and who can describe to you in great detail, what it was like. Oh, Hiroshima killed, Nagasaki killed a couple of 100,000 people. Yeah, I know that. No, you don't. I didn't know it until I read John Hersey's account of Hiroshima seen through the eyes of people who had survived and who told him what it was like to be there when the bomb dropped. And then, for the first time, I thought, well, yes, I'm closer now to knowing. So we have a problem of knowing, There are a billion people in the world who don't have access to clean water. Right? A billion people, 1 out of 6 or something like that. People in the world who don't have access to clean water. Okay, I know that, but I don't. And so we have a problem of knowledge and depth, of really knowledge that so profoundly affects you that you want to do something about it. Because you see statistics, harrowing statistics all the time, and you don't do anything about them, they don't really move you. The problem is really knowing something in a way that would move you. Why don't we know these things? Our culture doesn't really pay attention in a very profound way to these realities. Our culture is maybe a euphemism for our leadership, our media, our educational system, the ways in which we get our information, and all these ways in which we get our information do not confront us very directly and viscerally with what is going on in the world. So it's possible to have a total education right up through the PhD. In fact, the farther up you get, probably the more removed you get from reality. But it's possible to get a total education, you see, and miss the reality of what is going on in the world. So it seems to me this is a primary obstacle. We try to overcome it, of course. And you see attempts to overcome it. And how do you overcome it? Well, you look for sources of information that are outside the traditional sources of information. You look outside the main television channels and the establishment newspapers, there are documentaries that are produced, more and more actually. It's interesting. There are documentaries that are produced about the situation in the Congo or the situation in Pakistan or in India, and they do make an attempt to bring you much closer to reality, and they do have an emotional effect on you. And of course, it's a commentary on our culture that the kind of film that is least seen, the kind of film that has least access to mass audiences is the documentary. If you check with the distributors of films to movie theaters, and the ones who distribute American Pie, and American Pie 2, and 3, or Star Wars and Star Wars 6. And you check with these distributors and you tell them, I have a great documentary that I'd like to get into the theaters, and they shake their heads and say, well, there may be a few theaters in the country. But no, the rest, no. So it's, yes, there are attempts made to bring reality home to people, and the heroic attempts working against great odds because our culture puts great blocks in the way. So that's this business of knowing. Knowing is one obstacle to doing something about a situation, like a billion people being without clean water, or like 35,000 children dying every day because of lack of the basic necessities, dying either of hunger or diseases related to hunger. So yes, there's that obstacle, and then you run into ideological obstacles when you start to think, well, what can we do? Granted now you know. You know now. you at least you come close to knowing it, and you move that you want to do something about it. And but yes, there are ideological obstacles. By ideological obstacles, I mean, well, a belief in the market system. That is, the market, the market system takes care of things. I mean, isn't that the idea behind the idea of the free market? Yes, it will take care of things. It's amazing how many people have actually believed this. I mean, it's really amazing. And I'm not just talking about the current situation. In the current situation, where suddenly the stocks collapse and so on. It's interesting. There's nothing that troubles the leadership of the country and the economic and political leadership more than when the stock market collapses. People can collapse all over the place. It won't matter. But the stock market collapses. Oh, then and then for the first time you may even have a kind of revolution in your thinking. And we've begun to see this in these recent weeks and months since this crisis, the economic crisis that we've talked about, the revolution in thinking, which leads even the Wall Street Journal and Newsweek and Time magazine to say, hey, maybe the market system, the so-called free market, the government keeping hands off of the economy, maybe that needs to be re-examined. You even had some mainstream newspapers and magazines use the word capitalism. You even heard them use the word socialism. Now you're getting down to the nitty-gritty. Now you're asking about systems. You're not asking just about yesterday's piece of legislation or tomorrow's foreign policy. No, you're asking about something more deep-rooted. But it's amazing how, for so long, the culture, our leaders, our political leaders, our communication leaders, have been able to dissuade so many people that, capitalism is the way. It has its little faults, but it's basically okay. We'll come out of this and solve our problems. And now they're beginning even to question that. I say it's amazing that idea has held on for so long, because historically, and I guess this speaks to our lack of history, this speaks to our poor historical education, the history of the market system is not a benign history. It's amazing that nobody has connected the actual state of the world, not just of the world, which is easier to discern, but the state of people in the United States. It's amazing how many people have not connected the state of people in the United States with capitalism and the market system, and actually thought that there might be a causal relation between the two. It's amazing what causal relations people will see that are not there. And it's amazing what causal relations are there and that people refuse to see. But after all, in the United States, we have been living with the so-called free market system for a very long time. That is a system in which the government either pays no attention to the needs of people or pays minimum and token attention to the needs of people. Because if you go back beyond the 20th century, before the 20th century in the United States, as I say before the 20th century, because in the 20th century we began to have in the United States some moments of reform. We began to have in the United States some periods when the government, under stress, intervened in the economy. And I'm talking about the 30s, I'm talking about the 60s, and But before that, those people who have sort of paraded the glories of the free market system, why have this point? Well, before government interfered in the economy on behalf of poor people or working people, how did the market system function? And the answer is people work 12 hours a day. The answer is there was absolutely no protection for workers. People lived in the miserable hovels in cities and drank polluted water in the rivers of Philadelphia and New York, really. And because that's the way the market system was functioning. And it was only when it was interfered with that you began to get some change. And it was interfered with by two entities. Well, it was interfered with by people themselves organizing against their conditions. That's the miserable conditions of labor and the long hours and the poor pay and the lack of safety conditions. Well, they became the target of workers who organized into unions and went on strike. And, we had a wave of strikes in the United States in the 1880s, which led to, for the first time, the 8-hour day in many parts of the economy. And then, well, in the 1930s, we saw the actions of people all over the country demanding that something be done about their economic situation. We had a country in turmoil in the 1930s. We had strikes all over the country. We had a general strike tying up the entire city of San Francisco in 1934, just after Roosevelt came into office. Had a general strike in Minneapolis tying up the whole city. We had strikes of hundreds of thousands of textile workers in the South. We had all through the country, had unemployment councils and tenants movements and actually a very scary situation for the people in Washington, for Roosevelt, and a situation that led them to act. But yes, the market system, in order for something to happen, in order for some good to be done for people who are in trouble, the market system had to be, the idea of a market system had to be set aside. But of course, I say of course, we always say of course as if, but it's not of course. It's not of course. Yeah, if it was of course, I wouldn't have to be saying it. But we've never had a free market. We've never had in the modern capitalist world a free market. From the very beginning, we have had government interference in the economy. So there's an enormous amount of hypocrisy attached to all the slogans we've heard in the last several decades, slogans which you would think were only Republican slogans, but they were not. They were Republican and Democratic slogans. They were slogans repeated by both major parties. We mustn't have big government. I remember Clinton. Remember Clinton? Clinton. It's been a long time. Yes. But Clinton, I remember running for office, said, the era of big government is over. Meaning what? Meaning some of those government actions, like aid to families with dependent children, some of those government actions, have got to go. And of course they did go with what Clinton called welfare reform. But there was something almost laughable about the idea that the era of big government is over. It's called big government when government intervenes in the economy on the side of the poor, it's not called big government when government intervenes in the economy on the side of the rich. And from the very beginning of this modern industrial system, beginning of the history of capitalism, we haven't had a free market. Although they use the terms free trade and all that. Never. From the very beginning, the burgeoning capitalist enterprises depended on the state, depended on the government to protect them, to subsidize them, to send. The East India Company depended on the British Navy to make sure it could make inroads, right? Adam Smith is the guru of free enterprise, the spiritual, ideological leader of the idea of free enterprise. But the truth is that Adam Smith knew what the truth was about free enterprise. And to prove this, I will quote to you from Adam Smith. Of course, when people say, I will prove this by this quote, who knows, the speaker may have made this up. But, it's a chance you have to take. Depending on the fact that people are not going to check up on you.
We'll Google it.
And, of course, there's always some troublemaker who will.
Watch out.
But here, Adam Smith, where are you? This was a lecture he gave in the 1760s. Of course, 16 years later, his Wealth of Nations would be published in 1776. Same year, right, of the Declaration of Independence. But in the 1760s, he was saying this: laws and governments may be considered in this, and indeed in every case, as a combination of the rich to oppress the poor, and preserve to themselves the inequality of the goods, which would otherwise be soon destroyed by the attacks of the poor, who, if not hindered by the government, would soon reduce the others to an equality with themselves by open violence. Well, so that's what governments are for. I believe that.
Amen.
It squares with whatever historical knowledge I have. It squares with that knowledge. I mean, that's what governments are there to protect the existing distribution of wealth against what otherwise might be a rebellion to redistribute the wealth in a more equitable way. And you can see this in the early history of the United States. It's interesting. Here, The Wealth of Nations is published in 1776. It ushers in, the new American nation, which then, establishes the Constitution in 1787. And what does this Constitution do? This Constitution sets up strong government, big government. That was the idea of the Constitution. And they wanted the founding fathers. I know I'm not supposed to say anything critical about the founding fathers. They are our fathers. But the founding fathers wanted to set up a government that would be strong enough to put down the rebellions of the poor, those rebellions that Adam Smith was talking about. They were. It's interesting in all the courses I ever took in history and so on, and where they talked about the Constitutional Convention, and then occasionally they would talk about, they'd mention briefly the fact that there were farmers' rebellions in 1786, Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts, other rebellions in other states. But in all of these history courses, and in fact in none of the books that I read in history, did anybody say that there was some sort of, talking about causal connections, some sort of causal connection between the rebellions of farmers in 1786 and the making of the Constitution in 1787. Now I know the mere fact of one following the other, and there's a, philosophical Latin name for this kind of illogic. The mere fact that something follows something else doesn't mean it's caused by it. But in this case, we have pretty good evidence that the founding fathers, when they got together in Philadelphia to frame the Constitution, were very conscious of the rebellions that had taken place of farmers in Massachusetts and other places. And therefore, they were determined to set up a government which would be able to put down such rebellions. Put down the rebellions of the poor, put down slave rebellions, a government which would be strong enough to deal with is a euphemism for whatever violence you want to conjure up, deal with the Indians on the western frontier. But we've had big governments set up by the Constitution, and that a government which was established to keep down the rebellions of the poor and to pass legislation which would benefit the rich. If you look at the first economic program in the United States, in the first Congress, Hamilton's economic program, he was Secretary of the Treasury, it is the economic program, and what is it? One of the first things you see in the economic program is a bailout. Really, I haven't seen the word bailout used for the 18th century. Bailout, I'm sure people, what a bailout, this is interesting. That's a new way of doing things. No. And that was the first, you bail out the bondholders. That's what the first Congress did. It bailed out the bondholders. People who held all these bonds that the loans had made to the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. Now, these bonds would be worthless unless a government came along strong enough to say, and the government's capable of taxing people so you could get the money to pay back the bondholders. Oh, that's an interesting idea. Tax people in order to pay for the bailout. That's what they did. The other legislation. Well, and then we have from that on, we have a whole history. The whole history of the United States is a history of government acting on behalf of the rich. All you have to do, the legislative history of the United States is that, with a few, as I said before, a few exceptions, a few moments in history where some fear of trouble or some popular revolt causes the government now to pass legislation, Social Security, minimum wage, and so on behalf of the poor and the working classes. But other than that, the history of legislation is history of subsidies to the manufacturers. Welfare. Well, in recent years, we began to use the term corporate welfare. Welfare for the railroad companies. Hundreds of millions of acres of land given free to the railroads. Imagine a person, a citizen of the United States, approaching Congress and saying, I want some land. I don't have the money to pay. I don't ask for much. 100 acres, 200. Well, millions of acres given to the railroad. And in 1932, something like that, 31, the historian Charles Beard, the name isn't too well known in historiographical circles today. Well, he's known among sort of historians, people like me who are in the know. But most of the time, if you mention the name Charles Beard, he grew up like. But he was a distinguished historian of that time, and he wrote an article for Harper's Magazine. Because, it was 1931, 32, and the Depression had just sunk in, and the question was, is the government going to do anything about it? And then the cries went out, oh no, the government must let things settle and let the market work things out and so on. And Beard, no, we're a nation of rugged individualists. People will make it on their own. And Beard wrote an article for Harper's Magazine called "The Myth of Rugged Individualism." And he then went into detail about all of the things that the U.S. government had done through history to subsidize the manufacturers, the railroads, the merchant marine, and so on. Government, so that we've had this double standard. You mustn't have big government for the poor. Then you call it big government. Then you worry about it. But you can have big government for the rich. In fact, come to think of it, I say this as if I've just come to think of it. But actually, I thought of it before. What is the biggest government of all? War is the biggest. Talk about big government. Nobody mentions that war represents very big government. As soon as you go to war, the government is acting in an earth-shaking way with shaking everything up, the economy, and using the resources of the country. War is big government, with a capital B, yes. But so you have this double standard about. So what I'm saying is, and maybe I took a long and roundabout way. I don't like to think that to say this, but this is an ideological obstacle. The fear of big government. We mustn't have a single-payer health system. We mustn't have the government run the health system, because that would be big government. You see. Well, so instead we have big insurance companies. It's not a matter of big versus little, it's a matter of who's big, which big entity is going to do what and for whom. There's this thing we have to get over about the role of government. And of course, as soon as you talk about increasing the role of government in fulfilling the obligations of Article 25, right? The role of government in doing that, then, well, people throw out the word socialism, and which is very scary. That is, you're supposed to be scared of the word socialism, which is understandable. The Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialists. Ooh, that's socialism. No, that's not socialism. It's something else. Is it? But that created a very deep, abiding fear of people. But now, it may be becoming more possible to use the word socialism in a benign way, to go back to the socialism that excited people before the Soviet Union spoiled things, to go back to the socialism of Eugene Debs and Mother Jones and Emma Goldman and the socialists of Europe and Asia and Africa, and yes, and without fear of you being accused of doing something terrible. There's people have acted as if culture has acted as if I have to somehow distinguish. And it's very hard to distinguish because people absorb the dominant ideology of the culture, and then you blame people for believing things that have been pushed into their head. But they kind of believe that we have very limited choice, right? It's either capitalism or socialism of the Soviet variety. It's either those two things, and that's all there is. It's the only game in town. I remember Kurt Vonnegut in one of his books, I forget which book of his, but he had his own way of commenting on these nonsensical ideas, these simplicities, you know, and he was talking about how somebody is going into a poker game which is rigged, and everybody knows it's rigged, and so his friend said, why are you going into this poker game? You know it's rigged. And the answer is, it's the only game in town. Capitalism is not the only game in town. And you have to think in, outside the categories which have been given to us and which limit us in our thinking. Let me say one more thing. I don't know. I pretend that I care. My watch may not even be working, you know. It's always a good idea to look at your watch and the appearance and be concerned about the patients and all. Let's suppose we decide, yes, okay, we are going to do something. We're going to do something about Article 25. We do for the United States and for the world. You know, of course, the temptation is first to say, well, it's really for the world because the United States we're doing okay. But of course, we're not. You know, I mean, this is a fact that's sort of striking and instructive to see that here's the most successful example of the capitalist system, presumably, right? And this, you know, this is the country with the most gross national product, literally gross. And this is, and yet the United States has, you know, by now you know these figures, you know, 45 million people without health care, children, 1 out of 5 children born poor, and you know, this is the best. But suppose you decide you're going to do something. There's a huge, and the world has the resources. This is an important thing to notice because somebody would say, well, we'd like to do it, but we don't have the resources to do it. Well, the resources are there. This is the world that can produce enough food for everybody. They can produce enough clean water for everybody. They can produce enough housing for everybody. It could give jobs to everybody. These are not sort of natural impediments. They're not. These things can be done. There's just something very big that stands in the way, especially when you look at the United States and you know, here's the United States with enormous wealth, and here are all these people without basic necessities. There are 1.5 million children in the United States who are homeless. So there's this big obstacle, and that is war, militarism, the military budget. Suppose you decide that the United States has the wealth and the wherewithal to create a free health care for everybody. And then somebody said, well, yes, but we can't afford it. It's interesting what we can afford and what we can't afford. We said, we can't afford this. Well, but you can afford a $600 to $700 billion military budget. I mean, we have been able to afford over the years trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars to build up a military which was never used to defend the United States, and which was not needed to defend the United States, which was based on conjuring up would-be attackers that really didn't exist, even though there was the Soviet Union and so this. But no, the United States was not in danger of attack. Oddly enough, ironically enough, when the United States was attacked on 9/11,
Exactly.
we had 5,000 nuclear weapons. We had aircraft carriers that cost $1 billion each, $3 billion. Yeah. We were the most heavily armed country in the world, and then 9/11 takes place. So, no, none of this, these trillions and trillions of dollars spent over the years, none of them sufficed to defend us, and certainly not against sort of external threats, foreign attacks. So this requires a big jump in our attention to connect Article 25 and the need to help people with the fact that in the world, $1 trillion every year being spent for arms. Half of the trillion, American, because we have to have enough military weapons to take care of everybody else in the world. And Obama has said something like this. I hate to mention this in a situation where everybody, including me, was elated at the election of Obama. Well, not everybody, but yeah, my friends were elated at the election of Obama. Yeah. And so I don't like to mention the fact that Obama has said, no, the United States must maintain military supremacy. And then we have, and Obama himself. Yeah, let's get down to Obama. Let's get down to the present and to the reality of Article 25 of the American budget and domestic policy and foreign policy. And, Obama has said some good things and has done some things that move in a good direction, will raise taxes on the rich. Well, we're not going to raise them as much as we should. I mean, when Eisenhower was in office, we had a limit, 90% tax on the super rich. And now it's like 36 or 37, and the most that reformers like Clinton and Obama can do is maybe raise it a few percentage points on the rich. Really, they don't want to do more than that. The truth is we need a really progressive income tax. It will not impoverish the rich. We can make very drastic changes in our tax system. It will not impoverish the rich, much as I am sympathetic to them. Obama does not want to adopt a single payer. Or maybe he does in some future time, the single payer health system. Even though that the evidence for such a system, I think the evidence is overwhelming. And the evidence is that all of these sort of partial reforms, Hillary Clinton's plan, Obama's plan, they will help, they will improve things, but they will not get rid of this fixation on, we must involve businesses and private enterprises and insurance companies in the workings of the health system. No, we don't need that. We need a direct government intervention to give people health care. The way that we have direct government intervention to give people Social Security. And you can point to so many things where we have direct government action to help people, whether it's the public library system or the public school system, or we have lots of examples of what people don't want to call socialism, but really are, you know. But I say that just among us. But we have to look at Obama's plans and think, well, he seems to want to do good things, and he's moving certain things in a good direction. On the other hand, he's really not as willing to take on the big financial powers as he should. Otherwise, why would he be giving hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out when the very first bailout was proposed under the Bush administration, you saw a picture of candidate Obama standing with candidate, who was his name? How fast we McCain. We saw candidate Obama standing with McCain as the bailout, the first $700 billion bailout is put into practice, and they're both in favor of it. Really. And then, after he gets into office, acting to give more bailout money to the big financial institutions, then becoming very indignant that these financial institutions who've been given hundreds of millions of dollars are giving 150 million or 180 million in bonuses. And it will be a tremendous victory if we can take back that 180 million in bonuses. After giving 600, 700 billion or a trillion, whatever the figure is now, you know, to these same financial institutions. Yeah, I'm sorry to be so critical of the man I was so elated to see elected president, and for whom I still have, you know, certain fond sympathy. But I have to face reality. I have to face the reality that Obama is, a man with all sorts of good things that can be said about him. But the truth is, he's a politician, in the way that Abraham Lincoln was a politician, in the way that Roosevelt was a politician. Yes, there's good sentiments, and then there's powerful interests to deal with, and then there's public opinion, and I'm a politician, and I'm going to try to mediate between them, and therefore compromise, you know, in some way. And so, Obama, and this is getting back to my point about war, sometimes I actually get back to the points I started to make, but make the point about war being a great obstacle to fulfilling the requirements of Article 25. Obama has not separated himself from the idea of war as a solution to problems in the world. Hence, more troops to Afghanistan, hence the sort of gradual withdrawal from Iraq, but leaving 50,000 troops there. Not simply making a clean break and saying, oh, the United States is not going to be a war-making power.
Pakistan. Pakistan, airstrikes in Pakistan.
Pakistan, the Predator missiles. Amazing how many Americans are not even aware of that. Talk about what our media, if you look in the Times report the other day about, sort of almost, I don't want to exaggerate and say it's a glowing report about how these Predator unmanned missiles work, sort of something to be proud of. It's a real technological achievement, but about 26 paragraphs down in that story, it points out that there have been 35 such strikes, and a number of civilians have been killed. And this was something that was done almost immediately after Obama came into office. This is unsettling, really unsettling. And so we're not going to be able to get close to fulfilling the requirements of Article 25 unless we make a revolution in our thinking and our actions about war, militarism, the military budget, the use of violence to solve problems. can't depend on, okay, I'm going to wrap up. Do you really believe me? Do I believe myself? No. Yeah, I would like that when the speaker up there says, and in conclusion, and then he goes on for another hour. No, we can't depend on the politicians, even the best of them. The best of the politicians are not good enough. We can't depend on the best of them to fulfill what we know is only right, that everybody in the world should have these things. So the conclusion is clear. We can't depend on them. Depends on us. And here, history is instructive. Basic fundamental changes in the direction of justice and peace have not been initiated by the people on top. They've been initiated by social movements. It wasn't Lincoln's initiative to do away with slavery. It was the growth of an enormous anti-slavery movement over the course of 30 years that finally pushed him and Congress into the Emancipation Proclamation of 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. It was not, as I point out, the government for 100 years did not enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment for black people. They had to go out into the streets and demonstrate and create turmoil in the country in order for finally the government to react. It's going to take citizens' action to make the words of Article 25 come alive. And there's ample historical precedent for this. An ample historical precedent for getting over the notion that people are powerless and we can only depend on government. No, people are not powerless. Well, they are for lots of time, but they're not powerless when they decide to become powerful. Because ultimately, the power of the people in control of society, the power of the government, the power of the corporations, the power of the generals, ultimately that power depends on the obedience of people. When people withdraw that obedience, they are helpless. When workers go out and strike, the great corporations are helpless. Or if people boycott, people without power apparently, but if they decide to boycott, as they did on the West Coast in the 1960s and 70s, the biggest corporations have to give in. When soldiers refuse to fight, when they become no longer trustworthy in carrying on a war, and a lot of this happened during the Vietnam War, unable to really rely on people joining the military, more and more defections and desertions and refusals to go, and trouble with soldiers in the field. When the soldiers, then the war cannot go on. So the power is, the potential power is there in people if they would only recognize that they have this power. Okay, that's all I have to say.